Hey everyone, and welcome to Survive This Crit. I am your final guy, Nick, and with me as always is my lovely co-host, Kylie.
Hello, everyone.
And
Welcome to the podcast.
our podcast is focused on combining our love for horror movies and RPGs to answer that all-important question that we all ask ourselves at one point in our lives. Can you survive this horror film?
So, Nick, will you do us the honor of summarizing the film that we will be talking about in this 3 episode series?
Yeah, so Kylie, as you already know, we're going to be talking about the Blair Witch Project movie that came out in 1997, which is about three film students, Heather, Josh, and Michael, who venture out into a forest in Maryland in search of any type of answers they can find surrounding the myth of the Blair Witch. And they end up getting lost in the woods. They leave some footage behind. And when you know, 3 years later, they came out with a movie about it.
It's crazy and spooky,
Yeah,
which is what we're all about.
and 100% real. Wink.
Yes, the wink is very important there. So, an introduction to this film brought to you by your introductorian Arian. I just made up a new word today because that's where we're at. The Blair Witch Project concept was actually created back in 1991 by Eduardo and Daniel, the two directors for the film. However, due to funding issues, they couldn't actually get started on it until 1996, and then they filmed it in 97. It's ranked as one of the top 5 highest grossing horror films, which is based on the Netflix documentary, The Movies That Made Us. I'll link our podcast episode on Friday the 13th because Friday the 13th was also in that top 5. And it even held the highest grossing movie of all time up until 2002, which is when My Big Fat Greek Wedding surpassed it. So it's pretty hilarious that something of a totally different genre surpassed it. So the film was released July 30th, 1999, but of course the film first premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, as well as it went to the Cannes Film Festival as well. So the budget initially was 35 to 60,000. That's the general consensus. But by the time post-production was done, it was over 300,000. But the film itself grossed over 248 million. So it did really well. Like, there's no doubt that it was like one of the highest grossing films. It basically, for every dollar that was spent, it grossed over $10,000 in return. So as we'll talk about in our next episode with our very special guest, the ROI, return of investment, was freaking amazing for a film that was very, very low budget. The working title for this film was actually The Black Hills Project, or The Blair Witch Tapes. They kind of were shuffling around between names, and they kind of reached the middle ground, I feel like, between the two. But eventually the film was sold and distributed by Artisan Entertainment. They're known for doing Requiem for a Dream, Dune, not the newest one, but the older one, Terminator 2, Reservoir Dogs, etc., for only $1.1 million. I mean, in the 90s, $1.1 million was quite a bit more than today's money, but they still made a huge success off of something that was very, very small. The film itself was filmed in Wheaton and Burkittsville, Maryland, in only 8 days, with cameras running basically 24 hours a day.
Cameras running 24 hours a day? That has to be a little. I feel like that's a little invasive, but you know, I imagine that could be fun. I bet that's how they got a lot of the authenticity going on there, just having to be on all the time. So,
Well,
it just sounds interesting to me.
I feel like probably that may have been more of a catch-all phrase. I feel like in reality they may have turned it off while they were asleep part of the time until, all the ruckus was waking them up and stuff. But even then, like you said, it was an invasive film. And as I'll get into in the deep dive, the actors knew kind of what they were signing up for, which makes it a really ballsy film for the actors to be a part of. So it's time for your least favorite segment, Nick. The Rotten Tomato meter. What do you think the audience versus critic score was?
Oh boy. Okay. Actually, I bet you this one got a lot of high praise. So, are we talking about Rotten Tomatoes first? Right?
Yeah.
That's the idea. I'm gonna say 93%.
That's actually pretty close. You've gotten so much better at this. The critic score was
Yes, get better.
86, so a high B instead of a low A, if you're basing it off of a
Okay.
school system. What do you think the audience score was?
Okay, okay. Audience score. I'm just gonna say the same number, 93%.
Unfortunately, your audience score is way off. People really didn't like this very much when it first came out. The audience score was only 56%.
What?
Yeah, in fact, it was actually
Oh my.
nominated for a Razzie for Worst Picture, but it still had an
Oh
86%
my
on Rotten
goodness.
Tomatoes.
Ugh. That's depressing to hear. What the heck? What the heck, people? Maybe just back then, found footage movies were still just kind of new. Maybe that's why some people weren't used to it. And they're like, "Oh, what's this low quality piece of junk?"
I'm curious, so what do you think the Letterboxd reviews are? For those audiences who need a reminder, Letterboxd is an app for basically, millennials, Gen Zers, people who are watching this film today and giving it from the perspective of today.
So I'm gonna say 4.2.
You know what? It's not bad, but it's somewhat far. So Letterboxd has only given it 3.3.
What the heck?
A couple of the very short reviews were one from Meg. It took me an additional 20 minutes to finish this because about halfway through my television turned itself off and I thought they put the camera in their pocket, which is fair.
Who? No, I don't know who that person was, but they don't sound like they were using their entire brain that time. 20 minutes seems like a long time for a screen to go black.
That's fair. Rustman said, with how annoying these characters were, I was rooting for the witch.
But yeah, the characters kind of got to me too a little bit, but we'll talk more about that in our next section.
All right, you want to intro us into our next segment?
Our next segment, which is our thoughts and opinions about the movie. Kylie, what did you think about this movie?
So, I'll be totally honest. This wasn't my favorite horror film that we've watched so far, but it is really brilliant in how it's done. Like, the more research I did on it, the more I was like, oh, okay, you know what? I get the hype behind this. I think my one critical note was it really drove me crazy how much the three main characters were fighting. I mean, I get it based on the directorial style. Like a lot of the situations that they were in, a lot of these characters thought it was kind of real. So I understand to a certain degree why they would be fighting, but to a certain point, it just drove me insane how much these people were arguing with each other. So overall, I have great respect for the filmmakers who made it because they made something totally unique that hasn't been done before and hasn't successfully been done since. But I could have done with a little less arguing, and I think that's just a personal preference of mine. What about you, Nick?
Personally, I actually enjoyed this film. So, um, I know, right? Wow, we got one. We got one, Nicholas. Wow.
I'm so
Um,
happy.
it was a little tough at first for me, kind of like a slow burn at the beginning. One of the things that I was having a tough time with was the sense that nothing actually scary on a visual sense was really happening. Like there was some spooky noises going on in the background, some interesting props going on here and there. And then to just get to the ending of the film and we don't really see anything, kind of going all the way back to the first episode. We were talking about like what's the thing we don't like the most? Like, okay, like I was like, this is depressing. We don't see anything. But after I took a step back from that, probably like a couple days later, I was kind of thinking about it and I was like, you know what? No, this was actually a really good movie. It was not I wouldn't call it a trailblazer in the sense of being like a found footage film, because those have been done even before this movie. But the fact that it went into a subgenre of horror
And excelled at it.
where other movies before, that's the thing that really like got me in, like the fact that this movie was willing to
Try and make something different.
different than what everyone else was doing at the time, and the fact that they just did so well with it. um Seeing all that, I really enjoyed it.
I think it's definitely a slow burn, but by the end, I even was like tilting my laptop away from me, even though I've seen it before. I was like, I don't remember what happens at this part. I should move my laptop away so I don't get scared.
Probably one of the reasons why I ended up actually enjoying this horror film came a few days after I'd actually finished the movie.
Mhm.
Initially, I was like, okay, this isn't that bad. There's like nothing going on. And then, wouldn't you believe it? As I was developing our RPG that we will be playing in a couple of episodes, I started going back, going through all the details of the entire movie, and the memories of the movie were just playing in the back of my head. And that's when like a sense of anxiety started to come over me. Like I felt like there was something else like behind me watching me as I was like writing out the RPG. And that's when I realized like, oh shoot, like I'm actually kind of what was it? I was like, maybe this was a good movie. So that's why I'm enjoying it. To get that latent effect afterwards that I fear is always like a big component for me when it comes to horror movies. So I think that leads us, or kind of like helps us segue a bit into our next segment. Kylie kind of gave my answer here, but what did you think? Did you think this movie was scary?
I would say the lead up to the last scene is super slow, but it really pays off. Like it's so simple, but it pays
Mhm.
off so well. Like even though it's a trope I don't like very much, like you said earlier, like we don't like not being able to see the killer, but holy crap did it work. Like you were anxious days later. I was anxious days later too. So, I would
Mhm.
say it's 100% a horror movie. It's very effective.
So we're both in agreement. This was indeed a scary movie. So then, Kylie, can you tell us where does this lead us next in our little
We
episode
are
here?
going to be playing monster movie trivia. Dun dun. So, Nicholas is up on the chopping block. I know he was on the chopping block for the quiz, but we are going to be switching things up a little bit and having him go again. And, you guys are going to roll with it because we're going to roll with it. So, question number
And
one.
I'm sure the fans all love to hear me, get murdered. So
Exactly. I love to watch you get burned and murdered. So, number
yeah,
one, is this film based on a true story?
based on a true story. Man, it sounds like a trick question to me. I'm gonna say no. It's not based on a true story.
Congratulations, you
Oh,
got it
thank the
right.
Lord. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure.
Okay, how many days did they use to film it?
How many days? Ooh, okay. I'm gonna say 30. 30 days to film the movie.
No. I mentioned it in the
What?
intro. I thought you would
Can I
listen.
change my answer?
Nope, too late.
Oh, it's too late.
They filmed it in 8 days.
Do you think I'm listening?
I hope you are. Dang.
No.
Okay. All right. What state was the film filmed in?
This again? Ask me the location? I'm just gonna say Maryland. That's where the okay, so it actually was filmed in the place where the movie takes place. Good,
You
good.
got it right. I'm so proud of you. So, where did the film premiere? What festival did it premiere at?
I was saying it definitely wasn't a Sundance Film Festival, and I thought it started with a K.
Go with your gut. Go
Um,
with where you were before. I'm trying
I'm
to
just
help
gonna
you.
throw a random ounce. Sundance? It was Sundance?
Yes, it was Sundance. It also went to the
Sundance
Cannes
Film
Festival.
Festival? Oh,
Yeah, I went to Cannes Festival too, which is
oh,
a really big festival.
oh. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm still alive.
I didn't want you to
Boy,
lose
oh boy.
pathetically like you have in the before, because those were
Okay.
the warm up
What's the
questions.
next question? What you got?
It's gonna get a lot harder from here.
That's what she said.
So, while the witch is the main story, who was the character who murdered 7 children in the 1940s?
Rusty or Rustin Parr,
Look at you go! You're doing so good. I'm so proud of you.
right? Or is that? Oh wait, was that from the 1800s?
No, you're right. You're right. You're good.
Was it Rustin or Rusty?
Rustin Parr.
Rustin. Okay, I
But
remember
you
something
gave
weird.
both, so I'll consider that correct.
Yes.
So, what are
I'll take
the
it.
real names of the characters? Josh, Heather, and Mike.
It's
It can be first
Josh,
names.
Heather. Oh, Josh, Heather, and Mike. It's all their real names.
Yeah,
They
I
all
figured
play
I was going to
themselves.
trip you up because the next ones are going to be a lot harder. So,
Oh, sweet. But yeah, no, that's one thing I noted. Like when I started watching the movie, I was taking a list of all the cast, and I was like, playing themselves.
that's
Like,
probably why
you-
they thought it was a film about like a real thing that happened because they were playing themselves.
yeah. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the deep dive part. But let's continue on. What's the next question we got?
All right. So, how much were the main actors paid per day?
I'm gonna say $5 a day. No, I'm just joking. That's a joke answer.
All right, what's your real
Um,
answer? Bring it on.
I'm gonna say $100 a day.
Unfortunately, Nick, you have been slashed. Unfortunately, you're wrong. The actors were paid $1,000 a day. So
Oh my
pretty
goodness.
good money for a non-union film. I mean, the circumstances were pretty extreme to film in, but still, pretty good. What was the code word for the characters to speak out of character?
The code word? How am I supposed to know this?
It's a food. I'll give you a hint. It's a food.
Ooh, okay. Was it spaghetti?
No, I don't know why I thought you were gonna guess that. It was taco, so you've been slashed a third and final time. Nick,
Okay.
officially, you have not survived monster movie trivia. But I will read off the rest of the questions for the people who are getting it right. So there was only one scene that was filmed in Burkittsville. What scene was it? It was. Do you want to guess or do you want me to just say it?
Just say it.
It was the cemetery scene with Heather's monologue in the very beginning and the sign of Burkittsville, Maryland. And then, what is the name Blair inspired by? Blair is actually inspired by Eduardo's sister's high school, Blair High School, which is a school in Maryland. It's a real school. It's still active today. So, Blair High School. What famous horror legend / author is actually scared of this movie?
I'm gonna go with probably one of the only ones I know. Stephen King.
Yeah, you're right.
Woo! Let's
So
do
you
it.
may not have survived, but you got my bonus question right, which was Stephen King was not like this movie actually scared him, which he is like the horror legend. And speaking
Yes,
of
yes, he is.
legends, this movie founded a whole new, basically subgenre. Maybe not founded, but made it more popular. And I think Nick has some research on it.
Yeah. So thank you, Kylie. I think that's a great segue for a deep dive here. This movie, Blair Witch Project, is what is popularly known as a found footage subgenre film. So the found footage subgenre is it predates actually real film. It was inspired by stories that did a similar novels that used a similar type of writing style, storytelling style, where it's usually like letters or pages from a diary found from a character in the book, and that's how we learn about details of the story rather than its typical style of being told by a narrator, either like an omniscient narrator or partially through the lens of the character during the present time. So, a couple of the most famous horror-based ones that were found early on were in the 1800s. We had both Dracula and Frankenstein, all told in a similar style.
Wait, I'm sorry. Are you telling me that Dracula and Frankenstein are told within like the found footage style?
No, no, no. I'm talking. It's the inspirations.
Thank you.
So not
Okay.
like found footage. No, there's no found footage of them. No, but rather it's that same. It's the storytelling style
Okay.
of novels that helped inspire what later becomes found footage, where the whole story is kind of told from the perspective of one or more characters, like pages of their diary, basically.
Hmm.
So then the actual found footage film genre, one of the first ones ever made historically were what's this called Cannibal Holocaust, which came out actually in 1980, directed by Ruggero. I might be butchering the name, so sorry, but Ruggero Deodato. And that's one of the most notable ones as being like the first found footage film. However, there is another one that was made in the 1970s, but for some reason wasn't actually released out into the public until 2018
Oh.
for reasons unknown, and that's called The Other Side of the Wind by Orson Welles. Those are both the two earliest found film footage movies that were created. However, Blair Witch Project is noted as one of the most famous ones and the film that really kicked the genre off into high gear. So, because of Blair Witch Project, we later get movies like Paranormal Activity or Cloverfield, even ones that aren't even horror films, like Project X or Chronicle. All very interesting movies in their own right, all following the same formula. Kids with a camera going around filming their day-to-day lives. I did a little research actually, speaking of that, on some of the typical characteristics you might see in a found footage film. So, some normal things you'll probably see in order to help you determine whether or not a movie is indeed found footage. Basically, it's told from a first person perspective, well, either a first person perspective or through different styles of news footage being tied together or through surveillance footage being tied together. The last one there is what you typically see for like paranormal activity. Most found footage films are all on a low budget, which is why they're really ideal to a lot of filmmakers. The idea, like, oh, you talked about earlier with the incredible ROI for Blair Witch Project, you can make these movies anywhere from like $500 to $1,500, and you could get back thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe even millions. These films typically tend to have like a smaller cast as well that ties in again with the low budget and helps it also seem more realistic, rather than focusing in on so many characters. It's just a few group of friends together. What else we have? You won't see any soundtrack going on, no special branding or title cards or credits. All of this for the sake of making the movie seem more real. So, yeah, those are the typical characteristics you would see from a found footage film. And some of the tropes, actually. So I also looked into tropes for found footage. We have one called the apocalyptic log, which is basically, it just means like telling the story of someone's survival through a horrific event. So again, that's like stuff like Cloverfield or movies similar to that. Then we have another trope. People don't tend to like this one. It's called The Villain Gets the Camera. There was one film in particular that was noted as being a horrible offender of this. And this comes from Screen Rant, actually, where I'm getting this list from. So there's another found footage film called The Visit. And in it, yes, the villain gets the camera. In this case, it's a grandmother finds the camera and tries to jump scare at it for no reason whatsoever. So reasons like that, where the villain finds the camera and just kind of like stares into it and does like a spooky face, a little jump scare at you. While it does create quite a bit of fear, tends not to be favored upon.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring something up about the found footage era. I feel like we're in a whole new zone of found footage. If you include things like FaceTime and Zoom into it, because
Oh
there's a
yeah.
film that came out in 2020 called Host, and it's filmed entirely from Zoom by some creatives that in the middle of the pandemic were like, what else are we going to do? We're going to create a horror film. And I feel
Hmm.
like that film kind of falls along the same tropes that you're explaining. I haven't seen the full thing, but from the trailer, it's terrifying. So,
Oh yeah.
but it is like it's filmed with a small cast entirely on Zoom. So, do you think that would fall into that category as well?
Yeah, and I think there's another one that's a really good example. You actually just reminded me of it. It's called Unfriended. I don't know
Oh,
if you
yeah, I've
that
heard of
was a
it.
really good one. And I thought it was such a crazy premise of like I thought it was really funny of like five kids, five friends all get on a Zoom call together. Um, and they find out that a friend who committed, or not even a friend, some kid that they picked on like a year ago and then committed suicide, uh, is haunting them via their Skype call or their Zoom call, and traumatic things are just happening to each one of them, and they all have to watch. And I think they even like try and explain it of like they can't get off the Zoom call, or if they do, something terrible happens.
Yeah, it's
um,
crazy. Even modern tech is now playing a role in the found footage because found footage is less common now because you have Instagram, Twitter, etc., and you can just immediately upload it onto something.
mhm.
But Zoom, I think, is a good example of creating things through that while still making it authentic.
Yeah, and the whole idea, like anything can be found footage as long as it just has that setup at the beginning. Like Blair Witch does that right at the very beginning of like this film was found in 1997, but was made in 1994 by a bunch of film students, and once you know, they still haven't been found.
Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun. I tend to like movies of this genre only because it does try and create that sense of realism to it.
Mhm.
And it has that, I think they do a good job of making it seem like a very amateur film, which seems kind of strange to say, but it works, it becomes very convincing. And I think too, Blair Witch Project really got lucky with the time and place in which it came out.
Mhm.
Um, Being released in 1997 before people were like, really using the internet or before the internet was very much a popular thing.
I just want to give a quick note. It wasn't officially released till 1999. It may have been in the festival circuit, 1998, 97, but it wasn't released in theaters until 99.
Okay. Well, even with that in regard, 1999, yes, people were getting computers in their own homes and looking things up, but fact checking people about certain things on the internet, like it was still not as common of a thing. You could probably have looked it up online, found out, but not as many people were probably getting that information. And so it was very believable for people to just be convinced, like, oh yeah, this actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like audiences will hear in our next episode from our 90s nostalgic extraordinaire, times really were completely different back then. Nowadays, you can totally fact check something within 10 seconds to be like, oh, is this real? Is this clip that I'm seeing real? Um, and you can quickly verify whether it's real or not, at least according to larger media sources. But back in the 90s, that really wasn't a thing. It took time for news to travel and for it to be curated. So I think that's what made the found footage genre so magnificent. And in that brief window in 2020, before people fully understood Zoom and how it worked, I think that was kind of a window for some people to add more found footage genre content there, where it's just a little bit different than what they'd seen before. But now I feel like people can look things up so quickly, it kind of takes away the magic almost.
Oh yeah, and it kind of did that for me too. At the very beginning, I immediately like was looking up the cast and the crew for this for Blair Witch Project, and I was like, oh okay, let's look and see. Oh okay, obviously this isn't real because the actors then went on to do other things later on in their careers, and look at their photos right now. They definitely look older than how they do in the movie.
But it's still enjoyable in the moment to know, like, you convinced me. You convinced me it was real, which is something that a lot of horror movies don't necessarily do a lot of days, even if they say it's based on a true story.
Yep. Cool. Well, Kylie, what were your deep dive notes that you wanted to go into?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the production company and the direction of the film because I feel like that's the most notable thing. Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick were the directors of the film. They're both primarily known for their work on the Blair Witch Project, along with other Blair Witch Project themed projects. Like they had something that came out in 2000, something that came out in 2016. So they primarily, like, their careers are really very heavily Blair Witch based. They were like, they did other stuff too, but it's definitely less known. And maybe we'll do a deep dive on some of the less known stuff eventually. The production company that created the film is called Haxon Films, which the name is borrowed from the Swedish word, the witch, which is very on brand. So
True.
I think what's most noticeable about their directing style is that they had to direct from afar. They had to direct from afar to make it seem realistic. They would do things like shake the tent in the middle of the night and make noises at night to keep the actors awake and exhausted. So they would even like throw sticks and step on sticks and stuff. And they even did things like give actors less food each day of filming to get an emotional response from them. I will say nowadays with union films, that would not fly. That would definitely not probably work out well for anybody. But like they were in touch with the actors from a distance, but they were allowing the actors to kind of get lost in the story. So the directors would set up like milk crates with bicycle flags to give precise locations for where the actors should camp. The actors had like GPS locators to give coordinates, but what I thought was really, really interesting is each actor, when they would set up camp at a film site, each one would have an individual film canister. And in that film canister was their notes on what they should do in regards to the scene. So they would be given notes like, oh, hey, you need to lose the map tonight. It's really going to piss off everybody, but you need to lose the map. And they wouldn't tell that information to anybody else to keep the element of surprise as real as possible. So the cast was like genuinely emotional throughout this film because they were kind of being put through, I wouldn't call it torture per se, but they were definitely being put through a variety of extracurricular activities that were definitely intense. And one of the marketing campaigns they came up with, as I mentioned in the interview episode, next episode, at the Cannes Festival, they put up missing posters of the actors, like, this person is missing, report if you know any information on them. But it was actually taken down because a film executive was also missing at the time from another studio, and they didn't want it to appear disrespectful. The film itself took 8 months to edit by Eduardo and Daniel. It initially was a 2.5-hour feature at Sundance. And the scenes that were taken out, the scenes that we see today is definitely a much more condensed version, like an hour less. But the scenes that were taken out were used on the Sci-Fi Discovery Channel and on the Blair Witch website.
Wow. And I imagine that must have been like a lot to go through because you were telling me before that they were recording like almost 24 hours a day. So for 8 days to have to dig through, what was that, 192 hours of film and compress that down to like the version I watched was like an hour and 20 minutes. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's amazing that they got it down to that much. And as for like the writing and the camera work, pretty much all the camera work was filmed by the actors. Like, sure, the directors were in the distance giving them notes on how to do things, but Heather, Josh, and Mike were the ones that basically filmed this. And they were supposed to make it look kind of grainy, even though that wasn't the original intention. There was one film camera that they used, which was a 16 millimeter. Josh actually struggled to film on that, which is why it's kind of accidentally grainy with certain people's interviews, including Mary's. And in fact, as you notice toward the end of the film, they don't use the 16 millimeter anymore because Josh broke it in the middle of filming.
Oh
And
my
the
goodness.
show must go on. So that's why toward the end you see Heather as a primarily like film person because Josh broke his camera.
I didn't realize that was the reason why they did the switch. It's always fun to figure out the little motivations behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, and so they originally wanted the film to be higher resolution, but they also wanted it to look authentic, which is why in the end they decided, like, let's keep it this found footage style. It was filmed in Maryland, which up until a couple weeks ago, I lived pretty close to Maryland. I was in Northern Virginia. I can't believe I didn't visit the places where they filmed. I feel like I missed out there because I've driven by The Exorcist steps a variety of times in Georgetown, but never went to Burkittsville, Maryland, so I missed out there. As for the writing of the film, because I think the actors is the most interesting part, so I want to go into the writing first, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
care. Let's do it.
So most of it is unscripted, pretty much all of it. It was 35 pages of like a general concept of, hey, this is kind of what we want to take our journey through. The opening monologue, though, by Heather Donahue was actually written by Heather. The part where she's explaining the backstory and the mythology behind Blair Witch. Part of the writing also included Joshua and Heather initially being love interests, but they figured they would be too cliche of an idea.
Yeah, and looking at the way the movie turned out, that's probably the better idea. I couldn't envision any of them as love interests.
I agree with that. I think it would have been, based on how much they argued with each other, it would have been hard to envision them as love interest. Although it would have been really interesting to see like two of them as best friends or something. Two of them as really close to each other as in a platonic way would have been interesting.
Yeah, I could open up my mind to that possibility.
However, so the actors believed the Blair Witch was a real legend through filming. That was the narrative that Eduardo and Daniel wanted the actors to believe, like, hey, this is a real legend in Maryland. We're having you explore it. Yes, the exploration is fictional, but the legend is real. So that's how they didn't know that the actors that they interviewed were planted. They didn't know that these were just actors that they planted for it.
Wait, really? They just went up to random people and were like, "Oh yeah, these are definitely like actual townspeople."
They may have been told by the director, like, hey, you need to go talk to this person. But from what they were told that the legend of Blair Witch was real.
Oh my goodness, these guys got abused.
I know
Heather, Josh, and Mike all were abused. I don't.
It
They should have
wouldn't
been
fly
paid more than
today, that's for
$1,000.
sure. But they had a couple different script ideas and had a bunch of script varieties. Like the longest scenes that they found that were usable was the hotel scenes, like when they're in the hotel room the first night. It had the largest amount of footage, which was about 90 minutes, and it was mostly poetry and arguing, which I think is kind of hilarious. That before they go on this big adventure, they're already arguing and have like these conversations of poetry with one another. I would have loved to have seen that footage.
I don't know. They didn't come off as the people who would have the most brilliant of insight on when it comes to poetry matters. I
Okay.
viewed their characters more as burnouts. So they'll put it as that.
Are you a poet at heart or something? Is there something I need to know here?
No,
Okay.
I mean I've written a few poems for my wife, a few times, but no, I'm in no way a poet.
Well, so another couple things about the writing is the F word. I'll bleep it here. Is said 154 times in this film. And I think a large part of that comes because it was unscripted, and a lot of these were genuine reactions.
Yeah, I imagine letting a lot of people just go off script. F-bomb's going to get dropped a lot, especially if your character is like an early college student or something like that. I guess it's more my comment about like how people just like love to go loose with language.
I think you're right though. Without a script, like people in tumultuous situations are going to say the most common reactionary language that's on their mind, which is often cuss words, which I say as well fairly frequently. One idea they had for the script though was to have a giant stick figure chase them through the woods. But they eventually rejected that idea because they wanted the enemy to be this malevolent entity that they can't see and they can't really interact with. And that I think that makes it more of a fearful response for the audience to have in the end.
Yeah, that's probably that was a wise choice to have an actual figure show up in this situation. I mean, again, I was talking about like how I don't like the trope of like you can't really see the thing that is like
Mhm.
haunting you. But in this situation, it's a little different because we're never even given the possibility of seeing it. In this case, the Blair Witch.
Yeah.
Whereas my critique or my criticism was when you're only given like little bits and pieces of it. So it
Like you
is,
said, tentacles in the very
yeah,
first episode.
exactly. Tentacles like just coming out of the shadows and things like that. So to have a total mystery and unknown can add another element of horror as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I agree with you on that. It's kind of shifted my whole perspective on not liking being able to see the enemy because if I'm not seeing it at all, I don't even know what I'm imagining, which is more intimidating to even deal with. And I think that is a better use of the trope than showing, like you said, tentacles or a leg or an arm or a claw. Like, that is giving you kind of a general perception, but it's not as scary when you see a little bit of it versus when you see all of it or none of it.
Hmm. Yeah, and we're only given few details about what the witch actually looks like with all her hair and not touching the ground, just
Yeah.
floating. So you can only get a few details to work on, but it's a lot to work with.
Oh, absolutely. So, some of the production design bits on this film, the production designer was named Ben Rock. He's notable for Blair Witch related projects as well as other Shutter projects. So, they were super low budget, which meant they had to get creative. Like the slime on the backpack and everywhere else was KY jelly. As we know from some of our other horror films, like Friday the 13th, KY jelly is where it's at if you're making a horror film. It seems to be like the all answer for everything when you're trying to make something look gross or scary. So the scene in particular where Heather discovers the tooth in the flannel, it's based on it's kind of a reference to a 1922 documentary called Haxon, which found twigs with a severed hand in it, carried by a witch, which is also a reference to the Tom Irving story, The Devil and Tom Walker. But how they pulled off that production design trick, that was Josh's actual hair and real teeth from Eduardo's dentist.
What?
Yeah. Can you like I feel like there's a HIPAA agreement that agrees that like you can't give my teeth to a movie.
Wait, just to make sure I'm following you clearly on that. It's the actor who plays Josh. Josh's his actual teeth, right? You weren't
No,
saying the
no, not
dentist.
Josh's actual teeth. It's teeth that Eduardo, the director, got from his dentist.
Oh, okay, that's a little bit better, but still, yeah, someone else's actual teeth is a little strange.
Right? The designs for the giant stick person was inspired by the production designer Ben Rock had a book that had like witch based symbols in it. So he looked at a design in the book and he was like, this makes sense. I can make something with this. So he literally took a bunch of twigs from outside and made something based off of the witch symbol. And there's a really cool interview with him, interviewed by another podcaster, vodcaster, that hopefully I'll connect with him and we can have him on our show. But he talked to Ben Rock for like an hour and a half, the production designer, and he basically explained he saw this design in a book and he was like, this makes sense, I can make this. He didn't think the directors liked it because the directors initially laughed at him when he showed this stick design, you know, the stick man that we see. But the stick man eventually became the symbol that bridges all the Blair Witch stuff that came after, whether it was books, comics, other movies. This simple figure of a stick man was what brought everything together. And I think that's really powerful because it's a really eerie image if you think about it.
Hmm.
But Like
Well,
Ben
anything
Rock
is kind of
says,
eerie if it's just, hanging from a tree in the dark, you know?
exactly, exactly. Like Ben Rock says, it's the creepy simplicity of it is its power at its core. And that's
Mhm.
like in the interview that I watched of him, he talks more about how, a lot of the horror tropes like children writing on the wall and stuff, all that stuff is creepy because it's really simple. It's not overly overdone. Like the handprints in the Blair Witch cave, in the Blair Witch house, apologies. And even the lettering, which is actually based on a witch language a based on Hebrew, but the letters are reversed to show a negative fate and connotation for the person that reads them.
Wow.
I know that was a lot of information. I wanted you to have a minute to take it all in before I kept going.
It was. But you know what? I always love how much information you bring to the table. It's always great to learn even more about the movies that we enjoy.
Yeah. Well, so Ben Rock, like he said, simplicity was the power of production design. Now that we've covered the production design, I think it's important to get to the actors because they made a huge impact on this film. They were basically DPs and writers as well.
Let's hear more about it.
So the audition notice for the actors basically said, be prepared for extremely challenging roles to be shot under difficult circumstances. Here's a baseline of what the casting call would have said. Improvisational feature film. HFP is holding an open call for the Black Hill Project, non-union with pay, travel, and meals, shooting October to November with 3 weeks in Maryland. Seeking women and men 18 to 25 with a natural look. Extremely challenging role to be shot under difficult conditions. So the audition itself was entirely improv based. So questions that Eduardo and Daniel would ask would be along the lines of, so you got out of prison today. What's the first thing that you're going to do? And for example, Heather, who booked the role, she said, they shouldn't have let me out. Right? That makes me
Yeah.
respect her all the more. Like, holy crap, who comes up? Because honestly, like, she leads with dialogue throughout this movie. She clearly was the superior improviser. And she got a lot of backlash from this film, though, which is really unfortunate. She literally could not have an acting career after this.
Really? Why?
Yeah,
Why is that?
I honestly don't know why she got so much backlash. It may have just been the role itself, but she eventually retired from acting and got a career in medical cannabis in 2008.
Wow. What a career change.
Yeah, and
I know.
I think she was brilliant. I mean,
Didn't
I
I see her listed in a couple of the things on her IMDb page? Like she had a couple other uh movie or TV show appearances, right?
yeah, she was in a couple other things, but it wasn't like she made a career out of it. Because, I mean, most actors know that an actor's career is lifelong. Like, Blair Witch should have been the job that made her entire career, like, her agent would have been called constantly.
Hmm.
But for whatever reason, she got a lot of backlash for the role. I don't know if it was because how argumentative she was, which I will agree. She was very argumentative, but I think she had a lot of talent and did some great work within this film. She was very convincing that she was going to die by the end of this.
Hmm. Yeah, I was kind of bought in by it by the end too. Between that and then also it was Mike, correct? Who was left with her? Was it Josh?
It was Mike, yeah.
It was Mike. Mike was very convincing too. The level of horror he was feeling for, trying to find his friend Josh was it really buys the entire audience in. Like, oh, this is a guy who actually lost one of his friends.
Yeah, exactly. Josh is the only full-time actor out of the three. He's the only one still like acting full-time. Mike initially like quit his job when he got the gig on Blair Witch. He was like, "Oh, I'm not gonna need this job anymore." But his job was moving furniture for the one of the late night shows, I think with Conan O'Brien. But he actually had to go back to it because he wasn't booking roles.
Well, I imagine if it didn't work out for Heather, it wouldn't have worked out for him. So
You
Mm.
never know. Like it's a hard business no matter what you're doing within the entertainment industry. Heather and Josh though were known for arguing the most throughout the film, and a lot of that got cut out because Eduardo and Daniel didn't want it to look like the boys were just ganging up on Heather the whole time.
Mm. So were they like actually arguing, or are we talking about like just on camera, like as their characters just arguing with each other?
I think it was on camera arguing, but even then, like if you're an actor, this is coming from somebody with an acting background, it's a lot easier to create fake conflict with somebody than to create like fake, we're all in this together, we're gonna get out of here alive, because tension sells. Like tension, this entire movie, if I could sum it up in one word, is tension. They're building tension the entire time, whether it's with the actors or the footage. And I think if they had gotten too cozy with one another, it wouldn't have been as good. Two more quick things about the actors. So Mary Brown, she was one of the people they interviewed. One of the old lady. She was actually an art department PA, but they hired her for the role because she was so authentic in her storytelling that they were like, this is gonna be real for audiences because it's real for us. Another quick note on the production side is about 45 minutes into the film where Heather screams, "What the F is that?" She's responding to the sight of the art director, Ricardo Moreno, who as a prank was running alongside of them with a white pantyhose over his head. So it's toward the end of the film where they're running away toward like the Rustin Parr house, away from their campsite. When she screams, that's real. They were really being tormented to a certain degree.
Oh my goodness! Again, these actors were just abused,
It
and
wouldn't.
now to hear that nothing comes out of it for them. Oh my goodness!
Well, this film wouldn't be made today. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I think we could say with the age of internet and the age of how the film unions work and how they really try to protect their actors, even if it was a non-union film, I don't think they could have the same effect today as it would have then. But the ending, there were varied endings that they wanted to do. There were a couple references. They thought that Mike standing in the corner is the ending that they chose, but it was initially confusing to audiences, so they filmed Mike being hanged by noose or Mike being crucified by a giant stick figure. But they had to shoot an additional interview scene to explain why Mike is standing in the corner. And if you aren't paying attention, you'll miss it. But they had to explain that Rustin Parr would force one kid to stand in the corner while he killed another kid. And that is the only reason that the studio let them keep the original final ending.
Wow. Oh my goodness! They really went to all possible lengths to just scare the crap out of everyone working on the on the film.
They really did. And the effect that it has today is wild. Like the marketing for this film, the town of Burkittsville, Maryland, did a lot of promotions to get tourism up. They even had a signature Blair Witch burger, which was like very popular for a few years in a row. I know. But even hunting season suffered horribly as soon as this film came out because the wildlife was scared away. People were going into the woods trying to create their own project like this.
Oh my goodness!
In the Wiccans, like, were really pissed on how they were represented in this film, according to the director Eduardo. And the effects of this film even included people thought that this was real. Like there were some people that were sending condolences and like RIP messages to the families of the actors because they thought it was real. And there's still a huge cult fan base. And amidst my deep dive, I came across BlairWitch.net, which is a remarkable place that has RPGs. They have other footage of the film. They have interviews. They have so much kept in this little website of just people who are fans. And they create their own Blair Witch experiences. They're just the impact that this film has had on people is not to go unnoticed, I would say.
Going into this film, I thought I wasn't gonna like it because I was like, "Oh, this movie from the 1990s. You know, we'll see what the level of quality is." But to hear all the details that you're giving, honestly, like it just makes me like really love this movie even more. To It makes me feel really sad for the actors. The actors are really put through hell. But you know, everything else going on, the level of intricate details that they did to really make sure like everything about the authenticity of this movie seemed appear flawless.
Yeah.
Like that's some next level skill, honestly.
It really is. And I would call it like scrappy filmmaking, similar to Nightmare on Elm Street again. They were
Hmm.
making a movie out of what they had. And while I don't personally agree with like tormenting the actors in the way that they did, they created something truly remarkable about it that people 20 years from now are still talking about,
Hmm.
including us goons on our podcast.
Yep, just a couple of goons.
Just a couple of goons. Thank you so much for tuning in to Survive This Crit. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of our deep dive of the Blair Witch Project, an iconic found footage film. And if you don't mind, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching to this podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode with an iconic guest. Bye!
Bye, everybody.